So, thank you for coming. And what we're going to talk to you about today is Open Season, first movie from Sony Pictures Animation. Let me start by introducing the speakers that will talk to you today. On my right here is Sean Mullen. He's our supervising animator. Next to him is Darren Lurie, one of our CG supervisors. And next to him is Max Bruce, another CG supervisor. Very quickly, let me tell you about the format for today. I'm going to start with the trailer, just in case any of you haven't seen the trailer, and that'll give you some context for what we're about to talk about. And then after that, I'll get up and talk, give you an overview from a visual effects supervisor's point of view. And I didn't even introduce myself. My name is Doug Eichler. I'm the visual effects supervisor for Open Season. That's my group. Yeah. After that, after I give you my presentation, we're then going to go to, I'm going to show you some sequences from the movie between each speaker. We're also going to show you some clips that each speaker has chosen to kind of emphasize what they're going to talk about. And then after me, Sean will go, and that'll get us to the 10:30 break. And right before the 10:30 break, we'll take some questions for Sean and any that you might have for myself. And after that, we'll do the two CG supervisors. And then at the end of that, we'll have some more questions. So, like I said, let's just start with a trailer from the movie. I'm going to have to play this off my laptop, so I apologize for the quality. But like I said, this is just to give you some context for what we're going to talk about today. Ready?
Who's there?
Hey, buddy, I'm busting you out of here.
What? Boog was a bear who lived the easy life. This it? This my home.
I get it. You're like a pet.
Ain't nobody's pet.
Right.
Oh. Until Elliot opened his eyes. What's that?
You want one? You gotta go outside.
To a whole new world. Outside?
Okay, Forest 101. These are called trees.
Try again, I'll be kicking your funny blown bahookie.
You and what arm?
40!
Oh.
Fire!
Now, in order to survive,
The woods is no place for a bear.
they'll have to use their instincts.
I'm starving.
Well, what do bears eat?
Fish. Give it up for Boo.
This fall,
The hunters are here.
Hunters.
A bear and deer working together.
Luke, don't go out there. Oh, that's best.
the season is changing.
It's open season.
Where is he?
There he is. No, wait. There he is.
And the odd
Half doe, half buck. I'm a duck.
are about to get even.
When I'm a bearskin rug, they could walk all over me.
Come on, move it.
But until that happens, I ain't going out without a fight. This is going to be great. Charge!
All right, ladies, let her rip.
Martin Lawrence,
Oh, yeah. Don't mess with the book stuff.
Ashton Kutcher,
I come in peace.
Let's get him!
Ain't that your truck? That's a bummer.
Open Season.
What do you got?
What do you got?
Wood. You want to trade? Hey, buddy.
I am very sorry about that laptop playback. My marketing department's going to have my butt. So, yes, Open Season. Right off the bat, let me just tell you, you might have got most of that from the trailer. The movie's basically about a bear and a deer. The bear is a domesticated bear who's kind of been raised by a park ranger in town. And the movie pretty much takes place out in the wood because the deer's got the bear in trouble, and they've been relocated out to the woods where they won't cause any more trouble. And so it's the exploits of these two in the woods, making friends or not with other animals. And at the end of the movie, roughly, we have a showdown between our animals and the hunters because Open Season's about to start. So the movie opens September 29th, next month, and I really hope you all, by the end of this course, will want to go see it. And like I said earlier, it's Sony Pictures Animation's first movie. Let me quickly tell you about the relationship, what that means. Sony Pictures Animation is a new division to Sony, Sony Pictures, that is. And we all represent Sony Pictures ImageWorks, which you probably all know from all the visual effects work that's been done there. So the way it works is the directors, pretty much directors, producers, the movie makers, from the creative beginning story point stage of things are in Sony Pictures Animation. All the art department's there. Once they actually come up with a story, come up with what they perceive to be the look as far as 2D paintings go for the movie, that's handed over to ImageWorks, where a crew of approximately 300 people was put together to make this movie. So I'm telling you today most of everything from the ImageWorks point of view, just so you know. I guess I could just start with my PowerPoint presentation. For the most part, I'd just like to start by saying how proud we are of this movie. You're going to get that a lot today, but you don't have many opportunities to really say that you really love a movie when you work on it, once you start working on movies, I think. And we really like our movie. We think we've got something special on our hands. So I hope you get that from this presentation today. I'm ready for PowerPoint. All right, let's go. So from day one, our art directors and our directors were pretty much set on the artwork of one artist. His name was Ivan Earl. He was a background painter at Disney in the 1950s. He did background paintings on Snow White and a few other movies. And what Ivan Earl was really successful at doing in his paintings was drawing the viewer's eye to the foreground, to where all the action was taking place in the shot. These two images right here, this one and this one, are actually Ivan Earl paintings. And then these are art department paintings that were painted in the Ivan Earl style. When you look at these paintings, one of the things you can really see very quickly is this, what we call an iconic shape language. The trees right here in the foreground really show that off. Very strong silhouettes. A lot of detail typically was done in Ivan Earl's paintings in the foreground only. In the background you'll find lots of atmosphere and mostly just silhouette shapes. So remember that throughout this whole presentation. That was the visual goal of the movie early on. Directors agreed on it. Everybody was starting to get, we were passing out style booklets. What was Ivan Earl? Who was Ivan Earl? And so pretty much everything that ImageWorks was working towards was to achieve this Ivan Earl look. So now we have this Ivan Earl world. Once you start, these are a couple of paintings done by our production designer very early on. And I think you will agree that from what you just saw in those paintings, this is starting to encapsulate it. Obviously, this is more in tune with the environment that we want to have. It's more of a Alaskan type of woods. But you see all the things I'm talking about. In the foreground, you have these very striking shapes, very, very angular trees, very designed trees. And in the background, it actually turns into more simple shapes, less actual tonal value, more just, once again, shape language. So these three paintings all came out of the art department. And what that meant to me as a visual effects supervisor when we're trying to establish the look of this movie was, fine, so what's it look like in 3D? Because we already knew this. We're going to have 3D cameras. We're going to have big camera moves. We expect to have furred animals, things that may not fit particularly well into a traditional CG environment, or in this case, the Ivan Earl environment. We have some visual goals to achieve here. A couple of early drawings for our main characters right here. You can see, if I get my pointer back, this is Boog that I told you about, the 900-pound grizzly bear, and Elliot, scrawny mule deer with one horn. So early conceptual art for those two characters, a maquette sculpture of them, some early tree drawings that were given to us, a 3D tree, and then a couple final images from the frame. And I'll move on from there and talk to you more about our character design. Character design was accomplished by a man named Carter Goodrich, who you may or may not know. He's had a long, very well-known history in the animation world. So these are some of his drawings here on the right. Once again, what we knew about the movie at this stage was that we wanted that shape language in everything. Characters, props, backgrounds, everything. So we're going for strong silhouettes on our characters. Also, exaggerated proportions. You noticed it, and this is our character McSquiz. You notice his head kind of large compared to his body. In fact, it's almost the same size. Same thing, Beth here. She's got big old shorts. Kind of iconifies her. You know very quickly who it is, just based on the shape language of the character. Ducks with giant bills. Mr. Weenie, our fearsome weenie dog. Giant head, long skinny body, short legs. Deers, exaggerated, upper bodies, tiny stick legs. Once again, all just to get that iconic graphic language that we're talking about. We knew right away that we were going to have 4 main characters. We're going to have the two heroes, Boogan and Elliot, and we're going to have Park Ranger and our bad guy Shaw, who I'll introduce you to later. We also knew we were going to have 12 secondary characters at this point. So that's the rest. That's all the forest animals and what other town folk that we had. As far as just production-wise, what we needed to do, knowing that, was we needed to put most of our effort into those rigs, the look dev, fur, everything on those 4 main characters. And then the 12 secondary had to happen as a byproduct of those first 4 characters. So whatever we learned on those first 4, whatever it took visually to make them work, we needed to work that into the rest and just accept it. So had to accept that going in. And just an extra note, all the extras you'll see in the movie, all the hunters and any of the town folk, they're actually derived from approximately 3 or 4 of our other characters. So whenever you see a hunter, he's actually a male version of this big female character in our movie. And whenever you see the skinny hunter, he's just a derivation of another man in the movie. So you're just going to see tons of different clothing on them, tons of different hair, skin colors, and such. The voice actors for our movie, Boog is Martin Lawrence, Elliot Ashton Kutcher, which I have to say was a brilliant performance. Beth is Deborah Messing, and Shaw is Gary Sinise, another awesome performance. I promise there won't be very many flowcharts, but I had to do one. Just in case any of you don't know this is basic animation workflow as far as departments go in CG Features right now. Everything starts with modeling up there, so obviously models are made, UVs are created for those surfaces. From there, the model takes two paths, one into texturing, where we set up the look of the characters, paint texture maps, fur maps, all that. The other direction takes it into rigging, where they obviously set up the rig for the character so the animators can animate it. And then it also goes into layout. Layouts where all the camera moves are done, and basically shot lengths are set, kind of basic set dressing is done in layout. Animation, which I don't think I need to explain, and effects, same. Those both come out of layout and rigging. Look dev, I'm going to talk a little bit about before I hand this off to Sean, but look dev for us was 2 phases. There was a 9-month look dev phase that happened before we ever went into production, and that's pretty much where we invented all the looks of open season. And then there's look dev that happens during production, and that's basically all the props and any characters that get introduced after we start production. Almost last but not least is hair and cloth, which happens once animation is completed, and all of that feeds into lighting and compositing. So, like I said, look dev is an incredibly important phase for us. You pretty much have, like in our case, the movie was in production from start to finish once it started in story for almost 3 years. You pretty much have the first year of those 3 years to establish all your looks. Anything after that just kind of has to go with whatever the system will allow. So you have a year to invent, a year to experiment, and a year to prove or persuade your directors this is how it should look. One significant thing that we had to kind of invent, or at least change for ImageWorks, is because the CG feature pipeline, because you're actually populating an entire environment for every shot, every sequence, the amount of props, extra or trees, set dressing, all that is huge compared to live action visual effects. Take Stuart Little, for instance. Mostly they were just concentrating on a mouse or bird, and then the rest of it's all in the plate. Well, for CG feature, obviously, you need to create everything. So the look dev pipeline is extremely important. It has to be robust, it has to be quick. The artists have to have tools that enable them to pretty much experiment at will, Look, there's a computer monitor. Just show me 10 different versions of it. Show me, specular on it. I want to see it flat. Everything, that's what I expect out of my look dev artist. So due to that, we actually developed a look dev tool, which Max is going to tell you more about. But I felt it significant to tell you that by the end of production, we could look dev, I'd say, probably 20 props a day if we needed to. It was going pretty fast. I mean, and really what it came down to is one artist, if they wanted to, could take something from start, from model, completely to finish, and generate a standard, as we call them, that could go to lighting. So very significant and very important for our process. Another thing that was very important is that we defined a look for our environment very early on. This is not final, but this is what we call TSA01, Test Shot A01, and it pretty much was just the first render that came out of us that everyone said, yeah, that could be Open Seasons World. You know, you're starting to get the iconic little flower shapes. The rocks are specific shape. You know, the lighting it's CG in that it moves with the camera, but, you know, it's simplified where it needs to be in the shadows. Like I said, very early test shot, but it was starting to achieve what we wanted. So in achieving this look of an environment, it gave us a place to start testing where all our characters, once we started doing character turntables, we could drop them into the environments and say, yeah, that has the look of Open Season. Yeah, that would fit in our environment. So really a big milestone for me. Once we had something the directors agreed was an environment, albeit not as good looking as the ones that we took to production, it enabled us to basically spread our look dev out in many directions from there. And this is just an example of, yeah, okay, we have a rabbit animation, put him in the environment, and he works. And almost last but not least, the biggest battle we probably fought in production was over our trees. Just because you saw in those paintings how very important they were just to the shape language of everything. We actually spent 3 months on one tree, the very first tree we did. And that was really just to get to something that at a distance had this shape language that I keep talking about. But really, as you got closer to it, as the camera flew next to it, you got the detail. You got pine needles, you know, a full population of pine needles. You had the dimensions, you had self-shadowing, all the things that you needed. So Max is going to tell you more about that, but very significant milestone for us, achieving a tree, if you can believe it. Out of the tree came a bush that we liked. We got tree bark after that. Started to put some grass on the ground. Those are just the steps. For whatever reason, maybe that's not how everybody does it, but that's how it played out for us. And then we started making just these huge libraries of things that we could populate the ground with. Okay, so for animation, this is my way of introducing Sean. Let me tell you what the directors wanted. It was very, very clear early on that Jill Colton, our main director, wanted a very traditional style of animation. And by traditional, you can summarize that as cartoony, or you can just say really what was really good and really strong about hand-drawn animation that we were all trained with. And for me, that really sums up in two things. Squash and stretch, so you can overemphasize all motion. If an character throws out their arm, that arm can shoot past its length and then snap back, just to emphasize motion. And also silhouettes or poses. We needed a way to when a character entered into a pose that was representative of them, and you can go into a pose like this, but a character aiming like that again. We wanted a strong, squared off shoulders, one straight line extending from under the arm right down to the leg. We wanted all of that. And if you know about rigs today, usually when you build a rig, you build in so that it deforms and biceps bulge and all that when you have the rig working. Well, we wanted that too, but we also wanted to have these strong shapes. Sean's going to tell you everything about how we did that. But last but not least, in my last little item here, all of our rigs for our animals had to support bipeds and quadrupeds, because the animals basically, when they're amongst humans, they don't talk and they walk on fours, and when they're with the animals, they talk and they walk on twos. So just remember that. I believe that is all for me. I'm going to introduce, Sean Mullen's going to be up next. I'm going to introduce him with some clips that he wanted me to show you. And yeah, that's it for me. Thanks. Going to DVD.
The big rocks are called mountains, and the little rocks are their babies.
altitude. No jelly on, no jelly on. Come on.
How many times must I say it? I am the incredible Mr. E. Look, if you don't use the code names, how am I supposed to know that it's really you that I'm talking to?
A life is missing. It's all your fault.
What are you gonna do? You're funny. I thought maybe, but then I was like, and then...
This ain't happening. It's some kind of mistake. Think, Boog. She's mad, but you can fix this. All right, I'll go back and I'll give her the face. The face. Gotta get back before she forgets the face. That'll clear all up right there. Yeah, the face.
Boog! You can't just go wandering around out here. You don't know where you're going, Boog.
Tree hugger.
Knuckle dragger.
Veggie burger.
All right. That's enough for you two.
Listen, Girl Scout. They're dumb animals. I'm just respecting the natural order. Man on top, animals on the bottom. But your bear, now your bear is special. He belongs somewhere in the middle. Between two slices of rye smothered in gravy.
You're sick, twisted puppy, Shaw.
Put me down for a box of Thin Mints, will you, sweetie?
I gotta go.
Well, go.
Oh, I need a toilet. You know, the think tank. The log cabin. The Johnny on the spot. The Oval Office.
There's none of those things out here.
Well, what do you do?
You know, I can't remember. But listen, don't look now. But I see a little bush with your name written all over it.
A bush? Are you serious?
Come on, it's just like riding a bicycle. Only you're crapping on it. Show us your grr face, nature boy. Grr!
All right, morning, everybody. So I'm Sean Mullen, here to talk about the animation aspect of Open Season. Open Season was really a great opportunity for us in CG animation to tackle some of the problems that have kind of plagued us, I think, the entire history of CG animation, specifically having to do with capturing a lot of traditional principles that are very basic to 2D that we've never been able to get in CG. Starting to get a little feedback, sorry about that. Specifically, I'm going to jump into the animation style guide that we handed out to the animation crew, just to give you an idea of the type of principles we were trying to get. All right. Yeah, you can see that pretty well. So, in these first frames here, we can see some pretty... is everybody looking at this screen over here? I think. All right. We can see some very common hand-drawn techniques that really give you good, clean, simple forms and shapes. Like if you look at starting at his hand, all the way down his body to the cuff of his pants, you've got nice, clean lines. You've also got a nice, slight arc to these arms as he's moving forward that really help accent the motion. And as the motion gets faster, you can see that bend accenting even more in the arms. Same lines continue. You're even getting, if any of you have an animation background, then you've probably done the flour sack animation tests, where you take a flour sack and try and get clear emotional attitudes out of them and everything. You get that sort of clear flour sack shape that gives you a nice, simple design. We see a little bit more in this slide where as he hits the ground, we actually have him flatten out. You see him spread out also, so he's retaining volume. So that's like a good traditional squash and stretch. Then on this page, we start getting into more of the actual design elements that we were going for in open season. If you start with the caveman character up on the far right, you can actually see a nice principle that Jill Colton was asking for a lot early on, straights and curves, which is basically having a nice visual appeal to this contrast of like a nice curved line on the inside of this arm and some nice straight angular lines on the back of it. So you get a nice contrast between those kind of lines, and it makes for appealing shapes that really lend themselves to that Ivan Durrell style that we were going for. Obviously, it's very exaggerated in that example, but then you look next to it at the Sleeping Beauty frame, and you can see more in the realm of what we were shooting for on open season, actually against an Ivan Durrell background. The much more subtle sort of straights and curves things. If you look at even the top of her head, sorry, I'm having trouble getting my cursor back, there it is. The top of her head even is kind of straight with a little angle and then goes into these nice little rounded, flowy locks. We went for the same thing in a lot of, you can even see in these early drawings of Shaw and Gordy, the sheriff in town in open season. Shaw's got this straight arm with like a hard angle on his wrist that goes into this little sweeping point. Makes for some appealing looks. And same with, on Gordy, we have his arm coming straight down to his elbow and then hanging down. You see a lot of that with Boog also because he's a big, fat, 900-pound grizzly bear. And we did a lot of work like with the arm fat hanging from his arm. So if his arm's hanging down, there's the fat balloons up down here. If he brings it up, fat all comes up this way. So if his arm's ever like this, you see that nice straight angle and then sagging arm fat. This shows some other principles. It again shows the slight bend to things as they move quickly to accent motion. But it also introduces the way we wanted to treat squash and stretch in another aspect, which is here where the rabbit is catching the baseball. You see this frame where the arm really overshoots and then bounces back to its normal length. This is the kind of thing that we were doing in probably 2 or 3 frames when things like this would happen in open season. The goal being that you feel it more than you see it. Like, so you just get the sense that it's got a nice stretchy feel, but it doesn't feel like it's made out of rubber necessarily. Boog presented us with, Boog the bear presented us with the specific fat issues I was already talking about, but he's also got a big gut. So we have controls that we had to build to actually do these sort of things where we have a lot of overshooting of fat when he's moving around, even specific butt fat controls, which was good fun for all of us. This gives us a good example of some very subtle squash and stretch also that we would use for dialogue. You can see if you look at the first into the second frame here, nothing drastic going on, but the mouth is opening, the head stretches to accent it, and on through the rest of the frames. This page was meant to the animators as a reminder that probably 90% of the squash and stretch feel that we were going for could be achieved through simply posing the character properly. A lot of times when there are new tools introduced and everything, people's tendency is to really lean on them a little too much. So this was just a reminder that, like if you look at these drawings even of Donald Duck, Daffy Duck, and Elmer Fudd and everything, they're pretty much stretching without actually stretching the drawing. It's just the way they're standing, their posture. This was, Calvin and Hobbes is a fantastic example of just great, clean, clear gestures. Just a reminder to go for the simplest shapes possible. And also, we did a lot in trying to accent, the motion with our poses and everything. This actually, I'll talk about towards the end of my time here. We took a very traditional approach to the animation itself, a very pose-oriented approach that lends itself quite well to strong performances and the simple design elements that we were going for to get the Ivan Durrell look. And we also see some examples here with Elmer and Daffy that show using two characters together and still using all the exact same principles. So keeping all that stuff in mind, we went into the standard sort of testing that we normally do to build the rigs. These three little videos that I've got are the calisthenics tests that we do right away. We get a rig and we literally just pull joints as far as we think they're ever going to go in production, just to get an idea of where the problem areas might be, what we're going to need to work on and stuff. They're very revealing. We can see, like here with Boog, right off the bat, you start discovering, okay, those short legs are going to be difficult. We're going to need to figure out ways to get a good solid range of motion with those, because obviously he's going to have to walk from time to time. Beth's calisthenics test, we started realizing that those shorts were something to really keep in mind, because as you'll hear later on, they took a different approach really to the cloth and how far they went with the simulations, but that meant having more of a solid shape to those shorts, which meant keeping in mind how far we could move with them. We also discovered a lot about like her big feet, and that we were going to have to figure out ways to deal with those. And okay, here we go. And the last calisthenics test, these are really boring tests to do for an animator, so by the last one, we took some liberties with the Elliot test. Had a little more fun with him. So, yeah, and that also shows at the very end how we had to figure out if they were going to work going from biped to quadruped poses. Luckily, Elliot worked pretty well. Move on from there to walk cycles, which show you a lot of the same things. That's Gordy's walk. Sorry, I couldn't find one that looped for longer, but here we start discovering how their personalities affect a lot of the visual goals that we're going to need to do. Gordy is an old character. He's not moving around very fast. He's got very clean shapes to begin with, so we weren't going to need a lot of shape work with him. Shaw, we start discovering that he's going to have a lot of subtle elements that need adjusting with the shapers. Beth, we start feeling that she's a little bit more of a peppy character. She might have some fast actions and some things that we'll need to accent. Elliot is kind of all over the board, honestly, in the film. There's times when he's nice and slow and mellow, and there's other times that he's just an absolute spaz. The design needs of the show even kind of dictated how we would select controls on the character. We had a number of ways to choose from to select the stuff that we needed. One of the first things that we explored was having actual controls on the character. As you can see pretty clearly here, like selecting the arms by grabbing this and pulling it around, and same with the ears, etc. And you could adjust the visibility of each of these controls so that, you know, they'd be less obvious. But the problem with this that most of us ran into is that you would have these shapes all over these characters that you're trying to get clear, simple shapes out of, so they started getting a little distracting. We also had these Maya, Melscript menus that were like pull-down menus and stuff, but what we found was the best set of controls was a separate window called char pick that you could hold off to the side and access pretty much all of the controls that we needed to use. And this actually, these controls, what you can see here is actually just the tip of the iceberg, especially like if you look at the face. If I were to click on this low thing here, it would bring up in the channel box in Maya probably a list of 30 or 40 facial controls just for his lower lip. Same with, top, and given the fact that we had characters that had snouts so frequently, with dialogue, obviously you're going to have a lot of ooh shapes, like where the mouth is really pulled forward, as well as, broad smiles or like a broad E shape. And we found that it was kind of difficult to get that range of motion and still, not really mess up the hair guys, because spreading hair that thin, like from here all the way up to there and stuff. So we had specific separate pucker controls set up. That was probably another 30 or 40 controls. And this right here is a selection tool to turn on and off what I'm going to get into for the bulk of the talk, which is the shaper tools, which were specifically built to sculpt the characters and get good, clean silhouettes. But obviously having all these controls introduces the problem of consistency too, because you got all these controls, you got about 50 animators or so, all working with these various controls. So it's hard to get all the same mouth shapes. If the character's saying the same words from scene to scene, you want it to look basically the same. So we developed a tool called Snapshot, where I focused mainly on Elliot in open season, so I created all these pages of basic mouth shapes to show expressions, phonemes like for dialogue, brow shapes for more expressions, hand shapes for when he points, even some basic default poses for when animators were first starting their scene, just to get them in the ballpark, somewhere to start from. So that helped a lot with consistency. So now we're going to get into the specific controls that allowed us to really achieve that Ivandero look. They're called shapers, or line and shape tools. And what they basically are is these slices all over the entire character's body. And as you saw in that previous control, you could turn on and off each section of the body. Now with this, you had the option of grabbing entire slices and pulling them, so you could get like a nice rubber hose effect. That would help a lot with, like in that first frame of the style guide that I showed you, where his arms are slightly bent as he's moving through space. You could use them for that sort of an effect, or you can see these little arrows all over each slice. You could pull individual arrows just to pull one side or another, which would really allow us to play specifically to camera. Like after you would pose the character using the common joints that you always use, you could then go in and really sculpt it to get a good, clear silhouette. So here's some early development drawings of Boog that really get across why he was probably the most challenging character we were up against. Everything really had to do with his being fat. When he's down on the ground, we needed it to spread out, flatten out against the ground, all fall down as if being pulled by gravity. We have a number of situations in the film where he's got to try and get through an area that's just too small because he's 900 pounds, he's huge. So you might have part of him stretching and another part ballooning out, taking up all that volume that needs somewhere to go. And on, really. He's got tons of challenges. So here are a few frames that show right off the bat a scene where we were very successful, I think, in getting that kind of feel. Here's some still frames of like an anticipation. He's rolling up off his back to hop up off the ground here. So he's anticipating into beginning to roll. Then he rolls back and you can see all this fat around his head even, like smushing out. His arm gets all big and bulgy, and then he pops up and stretches. So all of these kind of poses throughout the film, they would have to be specifically sculpted on, every frame. Here's a little video showing how it ended up looking. So you can see, especially if you watch his head right there, you can really see it balloon out. And that's something that we were never able to do in CG before. At least not at ImageWorks. Here's another test that shows a different way that we had to deal with the fat very successfully. This was from pre-production. You actually saw this scene in the stuff I showed before I started, but this is the test version of it, and you can see in this still frame, a lot of times if he's moving quickly, then he's moving his arms or his body faster than all that mass would be moving because of gravity and stuff. So we would actually sculpt the way it dragged behind him. And here's how the test looks in its entirety.
This ain't happening. It's some kind of mistake. Think, Boo. She's mad, but you can fix this. All right, I'll go back and I'll give her the face. The face!
So yeah, if you watch those arms, I'll play it one more time. If you watch those arms, you can
It's some kind of mistake. Think, Boog.
really see how it adds to his weight and size.
The face.
We had direct control over how fast that thing's moving and everything, so you can really affect both the silhouettes for the graphic look that we were going for, as well as his size. We also found that we were frequently running into individual situations like this, where he's got to cast shadow against this curtain, and we were actually able to make it look in many ways like a cutout using those shapers. Usually in situations like this, we would need some kind of one-off solution to how to deal with the individual problems that pop up in every scene. But that was another benefit of those shapers, was that they really allowed us to tackle so many different issues that would arrive without having to set up specific special controls for every one of them that came up. But you can see, like, from his elbow all the way down, you've got nice clean lines. You've got, over in this frame, a nice straight line all the way across, and then nice flowing lines here. So we were getting that nice straight and curved contrast. Here it is in motion. That's not too obnoxious. Let's hear it again. Sorry about that. Now, something else that came up with a number of characters, since we had so many, furry animals, was that we were doing all this work to get specific clean shapes, but we were working with the skin volumes of the character, and then they would grow the fur off of that later. And in Boog's case and some other cases, that's long fur, so you've got an element that could completely compromise the graphic shapes that you've been spending all this time to create. So in his rigging and in the rigging of a number of other characters, we ended up having both a skin volume and a fur volume to look at. The fur volume was a pretty accurate representation of what we were up against. Like as you would sculpt it, when you would look at this, you would have a pretty good idea where the fur was going to be. So that helped quite a bit. Because when you're going for good, clean silhouettes and everything, you might want a nice negative space. Like if an arm's out here, you might want this negative space here. That could totally fill in with fur if you're not aware of where it's going to be. Now, another thing that we ran into with all these design elements, another challenge, was that a lot of the animators in CG don't have any traditional experience and haven't really ever had to deal with a lot of this stuff before. Plus, it's added work. It makes it harder to go through a lot of trial and error periods. So we also developed some tools for our render viewing tools, I guess, specific drawing tools that allowed, like myself or the other supervisors, when we're reviewing a scene, to actually go in, draw over the render, and we could save it out as a render for the animator to pull up as reference at their desk. So I've got a scene here that shows the animator's early pass. I'll explain what the adjustments we were going for were, and then the drawing pass, and then the final pass and how close he was able to get to it. This is in a sequence that you'll see later on called Puny Mart. Boog is getting a little drunk at this point in the film on sugar, and he's a little overexcited and kind of misjudges what he can do. So that was the first pass on it. And what we sort of noticed was that we weren't getting a lot of weight in him. We wanted more of a feeling of weight, because that's got to really hurt landing on his crotch. So the thing we wanted to go for was maybe bringing the arms in more of a broad action over his head and really having the fat drag behind, and then seeing them really snap as he hits the ground. So I went over it and drew these arms on there for the animator, giving him a rough idea of what to shoot for. Then he was able to do, this is the final pass. He was basically, I'll go through now, we've got some frame-by-frame, side-by-side things here. He was able to really match pretty much exactly what was in the drawings. On the left we see the drawing over the original pass. On the right we see his adjusted poses. And also pay attention to the belly in this one, because this sort of goes back to that hippo test that I showed you, the frames, the drawings from earlier in the style guide. They really accent everything. Like, you get that feeling of him falling with this belly dragging way up above him, and you can see how he actually was able to sculpt this fat dragging behind him in every single frame. I love in here how the belly's catching up and smashing down to the ground. So actually, let me just show you the final scene now once again, just now that you've seen the individual frames. So I think it was a very effective way of dealing with things and getting a nice, consistent and heavy feel out of Boog, and really getting good, clean, appealing shapes. So then we get into Elliot, and we're going to start seeing really here how every character was a completely different set of challenges to approach for us for their own reasons. Boog has big, broad, sweeping motions. The guy who was supervising Boog primarily, his name's Todd Wilderman, he always compared moving Boog around to if you were holding a big old tree trunk and trying to wave it around, while Elliot would be like if you were holding a twig and you were waving it around. You've got that kind of a contrast in the way you approach their movements. And you've also got the design differences in that Boog is big, lumbering, 900 pounds. Elliot is small, really thin, very wiry. So let's see, this is an early test, and we started discovering that there wasn't really a lot of shaper work to be done on Elliot. Sorry.
Yeah! Yuck. Ooh, it's terrible but wonderful at the same time. It's like freedom in a cup!
That's obviously he's discovering coffee right there. So some of the stuff we started discovering with Elliot was one of the few places that, let me go back to that first frame, that we did use shapers with some frequency. You can see that nice contrast of straight and curves in his arm. It was really easy to get that shape out of him using the shapers, so that was something we did a lot. We also started discovering that because he's so long and thin and twiggy and stuff, it was really easy to lose the simple shapes, just because, he's got these long, thin things going out all over the place. So most of what we were up against with him had to do with posing, less with shapers, more with posing. And this is also actually a good example of how we use squash and stretch in ways that were kind of invisible. When you look at how long his head is compared to, say, his arm holding that coffee cup, if you saw this test from the side, you would see that his arms are actually stretched probably to almost 3 times their original length, just so he can get that cup of coffee out to the front of his mouth to drink it. But through posing, cheating him so he's facing a little more towards camera, you could hide the fact that you had stretched it that far to get that feel. This illustrates some of the ways that posing played such a huge role in Elliot versus the shapers. His legs in particular, if posed wrong, would really break his designs. On the left we see the right way to do it, on the right we see the wrong way to do it. What we were looking for frequently was from the bottom of his foot up to what's technically his ankle, you would want that line to then continue on up, straight up into his back, kind of using the base of his tail as an anchor point. If you didn't have that, and you had them, say, this way, you've got a line that just sort of shoots up right into the middle of his body, and it starts breaking that Ivan Durrell clean graphic shape look that we were going for. We also found this was pretty common. His range of motion was a little difficult to deal with just because as you would pull the leg up, you start running out of room fast as it sort of does the accordion folding thing. We actually had controls to go in and move this point up and down wherever we wanted. So it's basically just grab that, point it where you want, avoid having it point up into his body or just off into space. Shoot for ways to get it to work with the lines. And we use the base of the tail as an anchor a lot of times. When you couldn't see it, you still were shooting for there. This is like if you were looking at a straight-on shot. These are the times when you would actually have the legs pointing up into the middle of the body. They had to kind of go somewhere, and this is a much more appealing feel than this. So here we have some more drawn examples of over renders, getting simplified shapes out of scenes that were otherwise a little complex. I know it's a little pixelated. It might be a little tough to see, but like in this original pose, I'll kind of do it with the mouse here. The head goes down into the neck, into the shoulders, out into the belly, and then the legs come out. So did a drawing that tried to suggest a little bit more of a single sweeping gesture to the pose. And so you'll see a lot of nice, clean, strong poses like that from Elliot that are gotten pretty much purely from the basic posing controls. Shaw, just given his design, shows us another set of challenges altogether. He has less just simple shapes than Elliot. Elliot was just, a tube with arms and legs. Shaw has all this cloth, and he's got, rolled up sleeves. He's got sharp wrists and stuff and elbows. So this is a very early test before production that shows a very successful way to use the shapers with Shaw. This is some Gary Sinise dialogue. Oh, what? Wrong control.
The wrong guy. We took the place down with the wrong guy. Is this Christmas, huh? Is this Christmas?
Now it's also a good example of that sort of overshooting and coming back to the standard shapes to get a feeling of squash and stretch that you feel again more than see. But here are some still frames that show how specifically the animator got this good, clean curve to the arm to really accent the movement. Even though there's some motion blur on this, the overall shape you're seeing is actually sculpted. That's not motion blur that's causing it to stretch this way. So he was actually simulating what in traditional animation would be called a smear, which is just a way to accent motion in addition to all the others. This is a really good example of that. Nice straight front end of the arm with a nice smeared backside of it. As we get into this frame, we see again he's getting that nice curve to the arms. In this frame, we'll go back and watch it once again, but when it gets to this part, watch how he kind of overshoots and then bounces back down. His entire body shoots up, stretching the legs out, and then he pops back down to his normal length.
The wrong guy. We took the place down with the wrong guy. Is this Christmas, huh? Is this Christmas?
What's that? Yeah, no. And is this the audio cord? May I unplug this for a second? Okay. Sorry about that. I have a test that shows really well the some other subtle ways to use Shaw's shapers, even in a very slow performance. Whoops. Or I'll just skip right past it. So even when he's moving very slowly, I've got some side-by-sides after this that show an individual frame comparing with and without shapers that shows pretty clearly how even in a shot like this where there's not broad action, his design kind of demanded that there be quite a bit of subtle shaper work done. Here's the pose that starts the shot off. You need to be slouching in the chair, have a nice lazy feel to him with like nice sort of flowing lines that hang down, hanging off the stool, his legs. really extended and have sort of a nice lazy feel to them. Now here's the same frame without shapers, and we'll go back and forth. I'll point out some of this stuff. This is a good example of getting the design element we were going for. Here, just using the joint rotations that are normally built into a character, his arm just sort of shoots right out of the middle of his torso. Go back to the shaped one. I was actually able to sculpt this and have that arm flow up into the shoulder and go all the way over into a slightly arced shape over here. And you see even this arm is very angular without the shapers. With the shapers, it's got more of that flow. And then looking specifically at the legs, like this bottom leg here, has a slight sag to it that really, it's one of those subtle little things that helps push the just being lazy in a bar chair sort of pose. If you look at this frame, this is the leg completely straightened out. And it actually almost feels like it's bent slightly the other way, even though it's completely straight. And we were even with the shapers, if you look at this bent leg, able to move the joint slightly so that it was a little further down. So it gives you a little bit more appealing contrast in, the size of the shapes. Like this, the shin compared to, the upper leg here. The shin's just a little bit shorter, so you get a little contrast as opposed to a very even, slightly more mundane feeling shape right there. So even in areas that you might not think require a whole lot of work, a lot of times you would find that you would really be able to plus a pose and get more of a traditional feel by just doing little touches like that. McSquizzy was a fun one because he was so, you saw him in the preview and stuff, he's just this little bundle of excitement and nerves and action all the time. And so he's always hopping around really fast, and he's always angry too. We get these nice opportunities with him. This is a subtle one to see in the still frames, but I've got the video to look at afterwards. With his point, he points down, you see that hand kind of overshoot and then bounce right back. Here, if you look carefully, you can see that this is a little longer and this one bounces back. Again, this is done in maybe 2 frames. When it hits that extended pose, it's there for 1 frame, probably an in-between where it's most of the way back to its regular shape and then back in its regular shape. So you get that real springy, quick hit. So here's the shot. I'll play it again. If you look specifically at that arm, it keeps hanging up right on that. You can see that little overshoot there. But if we were successful, then it doesn't look really rubbery. It's more of something that you feel rather than see. Something that was also a great benefit of having these shapers, a lot of times there are a lot of ideas that come out in story that are great, entertaining ideas, but we end up not being able to do them because they involve things that would involve, special one-off solutions again that would add so much cost to the project that you wouldn't be able to do it. Here we have an example. I know they're kind of small, but we've got Mr. Weenie, that dachshund, biting onto Elliot's butt. We were able to really shape it so that you get that nice, solid, you really feel the bite happening. Later on in the boards, you can see you got Boog stretching through the ceiling. And in this case, not only were we able to do it, but we were able to go much further with Boog than the storyboards did. And we were also able to accent certain things that were just basic ideas in the storyboards. Right here, we've got Boog doing a little dance at the end of that Puny Mart sequence I was mentioning where he's kind of drunk on sugar. Here's some still frames of what the animator did. We sort of discovered throughout production that it suited Boog's character that he'd be a really smooth dancer with great moves. So in this, he's doing this great sort of Chuck Berry jump up in the air, got that belly fat really dragging behind him, hits the peak of his jump, starts falling back down, and we see that big mass hanging behind him again as he drops down, flattens out, then pops up and spins around. This is one of the most disgusting things I've seen in the film, where that belly fat really slings out around to the side as he spins all the way around in the air. Here you can see he actually sculpted this fat all the way out here, swings around, catches up, and then he lands. Let's see. So yeah, one of the I referred to this earlier. One of the other things that we did to really get a traditional feel, one that lends itself to the Ivan Earl sort of look, was a pose-to-pose heavy approach to the animation. I'll just run through quickly the different approaches, pose-to-pose and straight ahead, for those of you that are unfamiliar. Pose-to-pose is where you pose the entire character from head to toe as if you were drawing it in traditional animation for the key emotional and movement sort of beats within the film or within the shot. So that you know that, like, just by looking at these still poses, you know that you're getting across what you need to with the frame. An artist I like to refer to a lot to get that across is Norman Rockwell was incredible at that. Every single one of his paintings, an individual painting tells an entire story. And you have to take that sort of approach when you're animating pose to pose. So here's a test that, this is early on. This is actually a little beyond the first pose test. This has some breakdowns in it that start indicating how the characters are going to get from each pose to the next. But this shows sort of what the tests look like. Oops. Boy, I keep doing that. So you can see once they get to a pose, they kind of freeze there. Hold until the next poses and stuff. But it gives you, like as Boog walks off, it gives you an idea what the extreme up and down points he's going to hit are, so we can start getting an idea of the framing of the scene, to really figure out how they're going to work design-wise within the frame. And then we've got, getting close to the end of the work on the scene, we start incorporating straight ahead, which is where you actually go frame by frame straight through the shot and just animate what ends up being more smooth, just fluid motions. So straight ahead really lends itself to that. A lot of times we would use that for like Elliot's ears, for instance. So you go pose to pose with his body, but then he really feels nice and loosened up because he's got these straight ahead sort of flowing ears. And his tail as well. And we can also see some areas where the camera is still old, and then we would send the shots back to layout when we completed them, and they would update the cameras so that they suited the action even better. So here's the final shot. Oh, there it is.
All over it.
Hey, Max. Mute me. All right, you got it now?
There we go. Okay. Sorry about that. I'll play it one more time. Thank you.
What do you do?
You know, I can't remember. But listen, don't look now. But I see a little bush with your name written all over it.
A bush? Are you serious?
Come on! It's just like riding a bicycle. Only you're crapping on it. Show us your grr face.
That's actually the last scene that I animated myself in the film, so I was pretty much working on that at midnight every night for a while, just up late in my office doing a poop shot. This is another great example of how pose to pose and straight ahead contrast each other nicely. This shot in particular has great strong pose to pose work at the head of the shot, goes into a really great scramble that's all done straight ahead. The animator just frame by frame sculpted every frame, and then goes back into pose to pose.
Boog! You can't just go wandering around out here. You don't know where you're going, Boog.
So I've got some keyframes here that show the extreme poses that the animator did, the anticipations into a strong pull, a couple of those pulls, and then yelling Boog's name there in the last frame. And then we can see each individual frame. There's nothing in here that you could really call a key pose. Like the body hits the height of its arc and everything, but the arms and legs are scrambling, so you never hit anything that you could still frame and say, this frame gets across this particular emotion or point. Every single one of them is in sequence working towards accomplishing an overall motion of a big scramble. So after seeing those one more time.
You can't just go wandering around out here. You don't know where you're going, Boog.
And now some animators also had a little trouble with necessarily going pose to pose, with their technique of approaching the shots, because everybody comes from different backgrounds. So there were a few other ways people would deal with things. They would do thumbnails that they would come and talk about before they started. I got some slides that make sense of this a little bit. You can see there was this sketch of Mr. Weenie walking in. He's got that in his pose. Mr. Weenie senses something and straightens up, like in this drawing here. We can see Bobby starting to walk in frame. Slightly different pose, but he's got the drawing that she's walking in here. Drinking her coffee. She straightens up as she realizes, whoa, this isn't decaf. Turns around to Bob, her husband. We see that thumbnail sketch right here, reflected in the pose. See Mr. Weenie sort of realizing something's actually in the dumpster, not just near it. He starts sniffing over towards the dumpster. We see her leaning in to talk to Bob, just as the animator has in his sketch. Mr. Weenie smelling more around the dumpster. Her saying her line here in this pose. And the final one of the series. And here's the scene as it was originally pitched to me in those storyboards, and then as it was animated finally in the film.
Ooh, this isn't decaf. You know what caffeine does to me, Bob. I'd be talking up a storm just chatting your ear off a mile a
minute. She's about to say mile a minute. So I think that pretty much gives a good overall view of how we approached all of the design challenges we had to get that sort of Ivan Earl feel, so that the animation fit in with the design of the film. I think we're going to show now a sequence called Seduction, which is way less sexy than it sounds. It's where Elliot actually breaks into Boog's garage and first convinces him to break the rules and leave, which is the first time that they really get in trouble in the film. So I don't know how to play it. Play it. Thanks.
Who's that? I'm warning you. I got 10 claws, and I ain't afraid to use it.
Hey, buddy. It's me, Elliot.
What are you doing here?
You help me out returning the bait for busting you out of here. Let's go. Let's do this.
Whoa.
Come on. Let's book it before the warden makes a round.
Nah, Cornflake. You got it all twisted. This here is my home.
Sweet.
Now haul your little butt back out that window.
Ooh, what's this?
Get off that.
So soft. What is that?
Whoa, what are you doing in there?
You know, this place is big enough for two.
What?
Wow, that's nuts. Does this look natural?
Give me that.
Ooh, who's this little guy?
Dinkelman.
Dinkelman. What, is Dinkelman your doll?
I don't care about that old thing.
Oh, I get it. You're like a pet.
I ain't nobody's pet.
Right.
Oh, I do what I want, when I want, and I come and go as I please.
Well, then let's go.
Outside?
Well, why would I want to go outside when I got all I need and... Whoa, what's that?
I call them woohoos, like, woohoo! You want one? I know where there's a bunch of them, but you gotta go.
Inside. Outside. Inside. Stop, stupid nose.
Woohoo!
This is Relocated. This is one of the first sequences in production, and it was illustrated our struggles from the beginning, trying to integrate our detailed 3D world into the 2D environment. A lot of detail in the trees, but still trying to figure out how it fits into the map painting. Later on, there's a couple shots here that I think more successfully show how our lush environment mixes well with the backgrounds. And here we see some of the ground cover we use throughout some of the more lush environment sequences. Dark. You see some of the ground cover that we populated throughout. Our classic redwood. Again, you can see a lot of the ground cover there, mushrooms and flowers and all sorts of really detailed. And our extras, which are seen in a few sort of critical sequences, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, just how the extras pipeline worked. I believe that's it. Hi. So as Doug said, I was one of the CG Soups on the show, and I was responsible mostly for lighting pipeline, lighting supervision, and look development. So let's see here. Just a quick aside about this slide. This is actually one of my favorite shots in the movie. It's a really good example of how we got to display the iconic shapes with strong silhouettes of the characters and how we try to integrate them into a lush, detailed, and yet painterly and graphic environment. I'll just give a brief breakdown of how I'm going to proceed. I'll talk mostly about the relationship between the art department and look development, because that was sort of crucial in figuring out the look of the movie, our procedures into key lighting, and then towards the end I'll get more into the technical stuff and the workflow of how the lighting worked. This is a somewhat familiar slide we saw earlier. Shows some of the initial sketches that the art department generated for us in helping with our not only character design from a modeling and animation standpoint, but also from a look development standpoint. ImageWorks, of course, has a rich history in developing photoreal characters. But to suit the sort of needs of the movie, we had to learn to dial back on some of the instincts that we have to make things look photoreal, and yet still maintain a level of detail that made the characters look appealing. Initially, in dealing with the directors, they weren't even sure they wanted real hair for the characters because they thought it would disturb the graphic shapes. And of course, we have also a rich history of hair at ImageWorks, and as Darren pointed out, we brought some very sort of iconic shapes into the hair and got to a pretty happy medium that everyone thought looked pretty cool. As far as the human characters go, some challenges there, which we brought up earlier as well, because the humans had more sort of stylized, out-of-control hair as well as cloth to deal with. That's posed problems with the iconic shapes, but also with humans, you generally expect a higher level of detail. It's just what we all are trained to see. So there was definitely some striking of balance there. There's 4 main characters in the movie, 12 secondary, and about 60 different extras derived from those main and secondary characters. As you can see in this page, there's thousands of character sketches we did before moving. Hey, where's my mouse? There we go. There's thousands of character sketches we did before even getting to the first model. These 2 little sketches up here are here's your standard sort of scale sketch, which gave us a sense of our size of our characters. But down here, this is an example of something that we did a lot of throughout the look development process, which is sanity checking. And this is just a compilation of 2D texture color files generated by the art department. And it was important to sort of throw all the characters together in a standard visual development environment and just see if there was anything as far as color or texture that really jumped out at us that needed to be changed. I would say a large part of look development is light balancing of characters. So we did, as I said, a lot of that throughout. Where's my mouse? There we go. Okay. So Beth, of course. Here we see some standard sketches. This is the initial modeling approval sketch and the color tonal approval sketch, as well as the paint over, which we saw earlier. And here's some quick look dev tests. I apologize for the codec. It's a little chunky, but here's a very early look development test of Beth. As you can see, she's looking quite sallow. Her textures obviously aren't there. Her hair's a little drab. Moving on to a more robust version, the hair's definitely popping out now. And then, of course, we see her close up in the forest environment. So I should say earlier we brought up the paint over process with characters. Excuse me. When we would get a character to a certain level of look dev and we felt that it needed just those final touches, we'd kick it back to the art department and then they would add their little final touches just to make it look great and then bring it back to us. And it was generally a more effective way of communication rather than just verbally saying, can you just make her freckles just a little bit less or something like that. So that iterative process worked pretty well for us. One thing, as far as look development went, things like eyes are always a deal breaker for selling a character, as most everyone knows. Again, early on, the directors were sure they really wanted detail in the irises, so we did some tests with some really simple, solid color iris shapes. And again, it distanced the characters from the viewer. So we came back to the sort of standard eye iris model that we see in almost every CG feature now. But as a concession to keep the characters looking a little more cartoony, we added a lot of white to the eye whites, and that also helped sort of maintain the graphic style. Shaw, of course, some more standard sketches here. The model sketch and another paint over in a painted forest environment. He was actually the first approved character for the show, and we wanted to see how he looked in a forest environment. As we mentioned before, he's got some pretty distinctive shapes to him that we wanted to make sure the textures only added to and didn't distract from. His hair and his vest pretty much define his character, and he's got these huge expressive hands, which were used to great effect throughout animation. One example is, I'll just show you some of these tests here. Let me get my mouse back. Here's the cocky walk, very early look dev, sallow skin, dynamic hair popping on. Here's just I'll show this again one more time. As I said, very early look dev process. The vest textures aren't really working well with the dynamic cloth in the vest, and his pants are up around his nipples, which wasn't quite what we were looking for. Textures a little farther here, look development a little farther. First look at dynamic hair, which was quite exciting. And of course, our sort of standard, mouth open test back there. We did mouth texture tests for all the characters because mouth textures was another one of those examples where you'd expect to see a lot of detail, but the detail was distracting at times. Another example for Shaw was he had really dirty fingernails, and whenever we'd see his fingernails up close, it was like, so we wanted to bring everything back to, you could read the textures, but they were kind of really simplified and represented more graphic nature rather than something photoreal. And then this last little slide, AVI here shows you a wet look test for Shaw. And standard kind of set of tricks here for making someone look wet, higher spec, higher reflection, matted the hair down, definitely different clumping in the hair. Extras. So yes, there are two major crowd scenes in the movie. There's a riot with the town folk, and of course there's a climactic scene with the hunters at the end of the movie. One of the things we did with the extras, or tertiary characters as we called them, they were derived from a few, like 2 or 3 main or secondary characters. In this case here, we see Bob, one of the secondary characters. Let's see, get my mouse going. Anyway, Bob in the top left corner. He provided the inspiration for the skinny hunters. There we go, over here. Bobby, his wife, provided the inspiration for the 2 big, there's the fat dad and the fat hunter, as we call them. Now, I shouldn't really say inspiration because they are effectively the same. They are the same model with just the same rigging, but with just changes in cloth and texture and hair. A couple of reasons for this. It was cheap, for one thing, but it also maintained the shape language of the film. Over here we see like an art department mock-up of the generic females. Again, this is like one of those sanity checks I was talking about. Mock-up of the females with the generic kids. This is something we threw together or the art department threw together for the directors, just to make sure that there weren't any patterns or colors that they thought were too clashing. And so that was that. We had to develop actually sort of a quick pipeline to account for all these different extra types. Up in the top left corner, we're looking at the generic female here. And up in the top left corner, we see the generic female Uber character. Now, I say Uber because what was actually translated from animation was just this character, which means it was all possible permutations and all possible geometry for that character turned on. And that's what got translated into lighting. Now, in the look development process, we would take various permutations and various textures and hair designs and everything, and then write out ribs that would then, at render time, get associated with this Uber character. The advantage of this was that if the directors didn't like a particular character in a crowd scene, or they thought something was too repetitive as far as the characters go, we were able to change it on the fly in lighting, as opposed to kicking it back to animation to get, generic female 2B changed to generic female 3A or something like that. So that was a pretty, that of course worked in concert with our proprietary lighting pipeline. This is kind of a little catch-all page talking about character look dev and lighting. Again, some of these are just sanity checks to make sure that our characters were responding well together. Up here we see in the top right corner our characters and a few vehicles all thrown together into our standard studio environment. Kind of, standard lighting test, just to make sure that they're all playing together well. Once we got them to this point, then we'd start throwing them in our forest environments down here, and just making sure that color palettes were working well and textures were consistent, and nothing was too drastically out of the style. Let's see here. As always, ambient occlusion and deep shadows provided a lot of detail with hair, cloth, and skin. And once again, if I can get my mouse back. I should maybe just talk briefly about how we used ambient occlusion value for hair. I'm just going to get this to play for a second. This is a little, just a render performance test to see how our ambient occlusion would perform with a lot of geometry and a lot of and furred characters. So it was just done very early on, just to make sure that everything was going to play together when we get like a forest of 1 million trees, and well, not 1 million, but a lot. So. And going back to the ambient occlusion for a second, because actually calculating ambient occlusion for hair was prohibitive, we calculated the ambient occlusion value for the hair by calculating the ambient occlusion value on the skin where the hair was at root level. And then we take that occlusion value and project a percentage of that up the shaft of the hair. Deep shadows, of course, showed the effect of clumping and the minute shading from hair to hair. And we often did like what we called a deep shadow from camera, which was just a shadow from camera view. And that provided a lot of sort of ambient detail as well. One of the problems, however, was with that is with heavily furred characters like Boog, sometimes the ambient occlusion value for a particular hair would start underneath like a hand or something like that, and then poke out from underneath, and then the hair itself would be unoccluded, but the occlusion value would get projected up that. So just to show you what that means, down below in the bottom left you see 2 images of Boog. In the left you see a dark line under Boog's chin, and that's because the occluded value was coming from the skin underneath and then going off into the hair. Sorry, I'm getting maybe getting too technical here. I'm going to get more technical later on. But how we resolved this was we'd also render occasionally 3D brick maps, and that pretty much eliminated all of that stuff. You'd also sometimes get these lines when the occlusion value would happen on a piece of geometry that was off screen and there was a lot of motion blur going on. So we'd sometimes get these strange light or dark lines around the edges. Again, using 3D brick maps helped that quite a bit. One of the things we sort of noticed in look dev and eventually in shots was that because characters and environments became more monochromatic in darker sequences, and that was actually, at the behest of the directors and art directors themselves. They wanted everything to go more monochromatic in darker sequences. animators and lighters had to be aware when like-colored characters overlapped. So you may get someone like Elliot, doing some crazy hand animation over like Boog's chest, and it wouldn't read. So we, of course, try to compensate for that in lighting, but sometimes, we'd have to let even animation know, and they may have to make some adjustment to just make that read a little better. Architecture. So there was a term we kept using on the movie a lot as far as getting the style down, and that was the wonky factor. A lot of the architecture geometry was intentionally modeled off-kilter, which I think was really important in establishing the whimsical feel in the movie. There's a town in the movie called Timberline, and the whole town is just a little bit off. So as you can see, a lot of the lines are a little bit crooked, and the textures were added to sort of help this feel. The bricks don't really line up. The printing's just a little bit off. Again, it all sort of helped the sort of slightly crazed feel of the environment. Shaw's Lodge, which is the image down on the bottom right, was this taken to an extreme. It's even more off-kilter inside the lodge. It's almost like this crazy maze, and that actually played more into helping the tension of that particular sequence, which I'll talk a little bit about later. Beth's house, which was another example of architecture in the movie, was one of the first sets approved on the movie, so it was actually fairly regimented from the beginning. But as we developed more sets, you can see that the off-kilter design kind of seeped in there a bit too. Beth's house, of course, is kind of like the set of safety for Boog, the main character, so it's a little more sort of secure, not quite so crazy looking as some of the other architecture in the movie. But as I said, you can see in the bottom right, there's crooked lines in the roof, around the windows. It's still got a little bit of that whimsy about it. This bottom right image is actually the first shot of the movie, so it was really important in establishing, both whimsy and safety. So it's comfortable, but not too crazy, like Shaw's house, I like to think. Props. Here we see 4 props: Shaw's table from his lodge, a random coat hanging backstage at the amphitheater, a display rack from the convenience store, and a shopping cart. And they're all very sort of off-kilter design. The shopping cart I don't think would actually move in real life. It's so bizarre. And it's kind of interesting to note that the most innocuous everyday items in the movie, like buildings and props, are actually the most designy parts of the movie. They're the most sort of crazy and the most kind of off-kilter. And it really, I think, helped the comedy when you see the characters in these bizarre little environments and trying to interact with them sometimes. I think it really sort of subtly helped bring out the comedy a little bit more. So with over, Doug touched on this a little bit earlier, but with over 600 individual props used in the movie, unique props used in the movie, we wanted to create a fast pipeline for look development. We wanted to have one person able to take the UV'd model to shot-ready prop with light balanced standards, as we call them. So we created this set of tools called Shader Machine, which was leveraged off of Maya's shading network node graph to allow look dev artists to easily build editable shading networks and then write those shading networks out into RenderMan shaders. So yes, it's a little bit like Slim for those who know, but it's a lot more robust for our pipeline. ImageWorks has a really extensive RenderMan shader library, and we didn't want to completely junk that, so we wrote a lot of custom nodes that plugged into that. We also wrote a set of tools that allowed the this shading network node to easily write out standards that would work with our proprietary lighting pipeline. The whole goal of this was we're trying to sort of bypass the standard texture painter, look dev artist, shader writer model of look development and just boil it all down to one person. And as such, we're pretty successful at that. For simple props like Boog's rubber ducky here, which we see, the Maya view in the far left, the node graph at the top, and then a RenderMan render in the bottom left, and down in the bottom right, his starring moment in the shot. It also allowed the look dev artist to do some rudimentary paint work, as well as help him or her understand the lighting pipeline a little bit more. All told, I think we had like a prop look dev team of about, 10 people, maybe 10 artists? Oh, yeah. So, in general, it was a much faster than normal texture painter, shader writer, look dev TD model, which of course we still used for hero character work and hero environment work. This is just a sort of a summation page, just to show you kind of where the shape language really sort of hit home as far as the props and the architecture went. In the top left, we see a good shot of Timberline, Elliot crossing the street. Crazy lines, kind of really sort of off-kilter design. On the top right, we see the Puny Mart sequence where Boog and Elliot invade a convenience store. A lot of repetitive items, but not a lot of really repetitive shapes. Even items of the same type are a little bit different. Down in the bottom left, Elliot in Boog's garage. A lot of sort of whimsical props there. And then in the bottom right, it's Shaw's cellar, where he's hunting Boog. And down here, you see a lot of sort of drastic, harsh shapes, diagonals that go nowhere. Not to mention the entire cellar's hanging with animal pelts. So you have these kind of weird, jagged lines really breaking up the action everywhere. So again, how the props and architecture really sort of help the design of the visual design of the film. Trees, as Doug pointed out, definitely one of the biggest challenges in the movie was trying to figure out, how to populate this forest with these iconic trees that didn't clash with the graphic style, but yet were pleasing to look at up close. These two slides on the left over here, these are two original Ivan Earl paintings, which provided inspiration. Over here we have this is just a turntable of a couple of the trees we used in the movie, our giant evergreen and our CPN. And what we see here is what was really important was that the trees needed to look good from every angle. Of course, it also needed to look good from every distance. But we couldn't have, of course, hundreds of highly detailed trees rendered a mile away from camera. So, yeah, we had levels of detail and definitely different ages, which would help the trees recede into the matte paintings, into the really simple graphic shapes of the matte paintings a little bit better. The most background trees were often just cards and were always oriented towards a camera. Another thing which you can't see that well in this turntable because of the codec, but as we needed a way to simplify texture detail as the item is shaded, which in this case we did with shader gag, but the bark was a good example of this, where you saw the bark up close and it had these really sort of cool stylized shapes in it, but when we moved to the shadow side, the directors just wanted to see almost no shading whatsoever, just like a really solid color. So we did that in this particular case with a shader gag, but there's other ways, of course, we did it, like in the comp, which I'll talk about later too. Down at the bottom, this is an actual shot from the movie, again from that relocated sequence, one of the early ones we did. It just shows the silhouette of the helicopter moving across the I think it's about 800 or 900 trees rendered. Again, very iconic shapes, and trying to sort of preserve the look of the Ivan Earl painting This also shows one of our most popular lighting gags in the movie, which was using the depth pass to really push things into the distance. We did that a lot. Just as some of the different types of trees we used, these are probably our most popular types: the aspen, the giant evergreen, our Christmas pine, and our spruce. And I thought these were just kind of really good shots for showing, the richness of the trees up close, as well as how they would recede into the background. Down in the bottom right here, we have Boog approaching our giant redwood. The redwood was kind of a unique tree. It was the tree that housed McSquizzy and his army of squirrels. It's also very heavily designed, so we didn't really have any ages or levels of detail for the redwood. It was a hero tree unto itself. In that way, it was almost a character unto itself. Ground cover. Ground cover was actually really important to the directors almost as much as probably the trees were. They really wanted the characters to feel like they were, when we saw them close up, they were in a really lush forest environment. And the ground cover was kind of instrumental in helping us build a familiar shape language that plugged into the Ivan Earl style. This just shows some of the ground cover we used: plants, mushrooms, rocks, fiddleheads, and some of the flowers we used. Now, we needed a way to quickly populate. This is all pretty much instance geometry or sprites. So we needed a way to quickly populate small instance geometry throughout the movie in every shot. So we actually created an environment team of about 10 to 15 artists who just did landscaping, basically. This landscaping was almost entirely defined by maps. Some maps were explicit in their type, in that they define ground types like grass or pine needle or clover or dirt. Other maps were kind of more general guides and were used as instancing guides for our general instancing tool, unfortunately named Git. Now, Git would dot the map of these defined areas with particles then that would grow over the 3D elements, like rocks and mushrooms, or sometimes sprites, like flowers and grass. As I said, this slide just shows some of the ground cover that would be instanced with this set of tools. Of course, for extreme ground close-ups, we would have our hero ground cover, which was fully modeled, textured geometry, which you see in a couple of small parts in the movie. This just shows that kind of process of building the environment. Much like the paint-over process we had with look deving the characters, we had a paint-over process for environment with the art department, where we would take a gray render from Maya and kick it to the art department, and then ask them to sort of define, well, where do you want your flowers, where do you want your mushrooms, all that kind of stuff. And then they kick it back to the environment look development artists, and they would populate. This just shows that. Here's the general instancing tool maps. The instances, this is like barley and wheatgrass, and there's a couple lilies of the valley here, I think, as well. Our grass maps, which then, of course, shows where that grass is defined. Our ground type maps, which show the different types of ground: dirt, grass, clover, etc., and the fully populated environment with trees and bushes. One of the sort of upshots of doing the paint-over process and kicking stuff back to the art department was we needed to do some top-down renders. And for scenes with a lot of action, we would actually do some top-down renders of the entire environment, and then take the camera frustums and show that broad range. So if I can get my pointer back. But what you can see is in the top right corner, we see the image wrapped in blue, and that is defined by this frustum over here. This green is defined by this green frustum here, and the red one by this red one here. So what this just showed us was that we needed to be careful about our overlapping cameras to make sure that our environment continuity was staying the same. So this is a lot of images here. This is basically the color script for the entire movie. And I think what this shows, excuse me, is the kind of controlled color palette that we used throughout the movie. Obviously, color was a very important aspect for the directors and art department for controlling the mood of the sequence. So basically, the color keys made by the art department, approved by the directors, and then kicked over to the lighting and look development teams for generating key lighting. Just show a few key lighting sequences here, and with their shots. Relocated, as I mentioned before, it's one of the first sequences that went into production. It's basically the point where Boog and Elliot get cast back into the wild. It's a transition between the first and the second act, and it's a very sort of sad, morose sequence. It was challenging as a first sequence to use right out of the gate because it's basically the helicopter moving over, vast amounts of landscape with thousands and thousands of trees underneath. And here we were trying to define the look of our 3D movie, and we were being kind of hamstringed by having to integrate into these very simple 2D map paintings right off the bat. And I shouldn't say simple, just graphic and very clean lines. So this was not a great choice for a first sequence when you're just trying to define the look of the movie, but we definitely got there. Beth's house came a little bit later on and was a little more intimate sequence. Gordy, the town sheriff, brings Boog back to Beth's house, Boog's home, after he's raided the convenience store. So it's actually shows how we match the color keys pretty well. The color key, of course, down in the bottom left corner, and the corresponding shots around it. This also shows that aside from the very controlled color palette, there was a lot of very dark sequences in this film. At my count, there's about 14 sequences at dusk or night, while only about 11 during the day. And the nice thing about having the dark sequences from a lighting perspective is that you have a lot of unique, isolated lighting sources. There's backstage at an amphitheater, campfire sites, there's moonlit sequences, all kind of fun. And here we have headlights, all very sort of fun stuff to light. Down in the bottom right corner, we also see the use of the depth gag once again, which, as I said, we used a lot of. Yeah. Here we see butting heads, which was actually a pretty monochromatic sequence as well. Once again, yellow and orange, the overriding colors. I think it kind of emphasized the conflict between the characters, between Elliot and his arch nemesis, Ian, the alpha deer. Again, you kind of see in the bottom right corner, this kind of idyllic setting, very controlled color palette, and this sort of helped contrast with the comedy of the scene. Shaw's Lodge, one of my favorite sequences for lighting. The interior jumps from kind of one discrete light source to another, ambient moonlight to open fridge door to lightning and such. It's interesting because in this sequence, there was a lot of shots that were completely dark, not lit at all. So it's kind of like, how do you light something in the dark? The only thing we had was a very dim ambient, so it was interesting to sort of make that work. As you can see in this little center slide here, this was how the art department defined how they wanted those individual lighting sources to look color-wise. So again, very important for establishing the mood. Some early environment tests. see here. There we go. This is very early on. This obviously shows some issues with our matte painting integration with the detailed trees, a more naturalistic palette that was quickly rejected, and also use of long shadows as design elements. We also start to see some of the first indication of the ground cover's shape language. This was another early test which just showed, once again, how the trees were integrating into the background a little bit better now, how our first look at water and our first look at our ground cover. Another example of trees integrating environment. Our first look at ground cover, you can see some of the flowers populated here. Also, a first look, one of our first serious looks at Elliot, a good example of how we pulled back on the textures to make the character a little more appealing. He's got a little too much going on in the face texture-wise, and we definitely pulled back on that just to make him a little more appealing. And, of course, our forest environment, which we used for sort of final look dev on almost all of our characters. It also provided the inspiration for creating the ground coverage tools, which I talked about earlier. Finally, I'm just going to go over kind of how the lighting pipeline worked. This is just a quick, on the left is a quick example of our lighting compositing script. This is just a quick shot of the flow graph. Most lighting was really done in the comp. We took an initial pass with key lighting rig with, just a basic balancing of lights. But and then we'd write out that beauty, but then we'd use RenderMan's additional output variables to completely split out the lighting into individual light passes. So like our key ambient rim fill, everything were rendered as separate passes automatically. And then we had a few compositing macros, which allowed us to just do some quick mixing in the comp. We also, we did a lot of balancing, but this resolved a lot of the issues with like reflection and subsurface scatter not adding correctly. We just tinkered with our shaders a bit, and soon everything was adding pretty quickly. The plus side is the AOVs, the additional output variables, cost almost nothing to render time-wise if you're rendering the beauty anyway. So I'd say ultimately like 80% of the lighting was really done in the comp. I mean, the sunny day sequences were usually lit with just those three lights, key, ambient, and fill. And because we pushed so much out of our ambient light, sometimes it would just be key and ambient. I should also mention we used a lot of utility passes in 2D. Here we see a matte layer pass, which we were able to write out 24 channel tips in an AOV, which would isolate various parts of the characters so we could control them in the comp. We'd also write out like a normal pass for doing some quick diffuse lighting in the comp. And here we see like a world space y-axis pass for the character. We even did things like write out the normal and I-vector AOVs and would make macros in the comp for doing like specular and reflection and eye highlight lighting. Basically, we lit about 1,200 shots in well under a year, and a large part of that was due to the RenderMan AOVs. On average, each character was rendered with maybe 12 additional output variables. And obviously, we were able to iterate much faster in the comp. Basically, how our lighting team broke down, we had 4 teams of lighters, 10 to 15 lighters each. Let's see. In the example here, the original character is in the top left, and then and down below we did the processing, brighten, warm the key in the rim, introduced a Y-grad, and brighten the eyebrows, eyes, and ears. Finally, I just want to sort of just touch on all the many sort of tricks and gags we did in the comp. There was a lot done in the comp, and it was mostly completely in the service of flattening the look of the background and making the characters pop. We reduced a lot of detail and contrast in the darker areas, either in the comp or through shader tricks, which I mentioned earlier, or by reducing the deep shadow contribution in the furred animals. We used 3D blockers in 2D to like darken or lighten or model the lighting through using the camera or world space pass. As Doug said, we did a lot of just really simple vignetting and grads, which you can see in these two images. The top image was an early iteration. The bottom image is the final. We did a lot of slide mapping with noise fields and kooks to create dappling. We did a lot of pan and tile, moving camera shots. We would write out, for those who don't know, we'd write out a 3D tile and the shot camera created in Maya, and then we wrote that out into data that our 2D compositing package could understand, so that we could easily like track rotos throughout the shot. This was also especially useful for cast shadows. As mentioned before, cast shadows were a heavy design element in the movie, and we did just about everything to make these cast shadows work except use the real cast shadow. Usually the real cast shadow didn't get us anything, so we would do everything from like painting it to placing a phony light to using pan and tile once again to stretch it out in a moving shot. And I would say also, we use, as I said, we use normal and eye vector passes to add like eye highlights, things like that. Again, probably most of all, I'd say our depth passes were crucial in just making our characters pop and making the environment feel like an environment and not just a bunch of planes of images. So we would use depth passes to do everything from just push the trees back to change them to the color of the matte painting to create defocus. So definitely, I would say a lot of this was achieved through using RenderMan's AOVs and having some pretty clever compositing macros. Just quickly in this shot, we graded Elliot's legs darker in the y-axis using the world space pass and a 3D blocker on the key pass. We vignetted the whole shot. We added dappled light to the ground, and we added some defocus to the background in depth. So that's pretty much it for me. I just wanted to sort of show you these original designs from the art department and where they ended up to the two images on the right, which are actual shots from the movie. So there was obviously a lot of back and forth between the art department and the look development department. And it was a really great learning experience because they didn't know a lot about 3D and we didn't know a lot about 2D. So I think we came to a pretty happy medium. And I think that's about it for me. So thank you.
All right, welcome back. So like I told you, next speaker up is Darren Lurie. He's going to come and talk to you about our hair cloth and effects that we did on open season. From my point of view, the challenges for hair cloth and effects were that as Sean just told you, we spent all this work, getting this nice set of shapers for our characters, getting that shape language into our characters so that we didn't go against our Ivan Earl world that we had set up. So after we had done all that, we don't want to come along and put on dynamic hair and dynamic cloth and make it all furry and then cut all those shape lines that had just been worked on. So Darren's challenge and Darren's team's challenge were to come up with a dynamic hair system that didn't go against that, but also come up with a fur look that was rich in detail, kind of what you would expect out of CG these days, but also carried through all those the shape language that we had talked about earlier. Same with effects, pretty much. We have one big effect sequence. Well, we got a lot of effects, but one sequence that's significant, and that is this breaking dam sequence where the characters ride this log down this whitewater ride. All the same problems apply. We had to come up with a graphic look for it, yet we wanted reality in our water. We wanted, character interaction with that water. We wanted interaction with the environment. We wanted our characters to get wet. So we have dynamic hair that now needs to get wet. So basically a whole nother look for all of our characters. We needed the simulation for the fluids in this scene to do everything that we know water should do. It should fill up areas, it should knock down things. So those are the challenges. I'm going to set Darren up here with some shots that he picked out for you, and then Darren will come up. DVD.
It's not my fault. I tried to teach him the basics. I took him fishing, but he didn't want to get wet. Gordy, please.
Oh, no. Boog is sorry.
Beth, you're not his mother.
I'm not mothering him. Excuse me. Go to bed, Boog!
Out of my way! Boom! Show's over, you four-legged freaks of nature!
Have some privacy?
What do you think you're doing on my house?
This is your house? Oh, I didn't know.
It would probably be an improvement.
What did you just say to me, Rosie?
Nothing. Why are you gonna be so sensitive?
Boogster, what's the dealio?
You better watch your mouth or you're gonna get yourself in a lot of trouble, girlfriend.
You're just jealous because you ain't got a man.
I don't know, some kind of chick fight.
Even go there, honey.
Elliot, what'd I do?
Well, that's easy. You just gotta mark your territory. Show 'em who's boss.
All right, ladies. I'm laying down the law.
Well, that's, of course, they're skunks.
Oh, disgusting. Hey, whoa. We're just supposed to run him into town.
Well, it's capability start running, isn't it?
Holy.
Hey, girl, ain't that your truck? Oh, that's a bum.
Good morning. I'm Darren Lurie, and I was a CG supervisor on Open Season, and I was covering the cloth, hair, and effects. So one of the biggest challenges that we had was obviously trying to incorporate this Ivan Earl style into cloth, hair, and effects. And part of that issue was the squash and stretch, especially for cloth. So let's start with cloth. As you can tell from our style guide here, we have lots of different situations with bell shapes here with Beth, as you can tell from her shorts, which had to be maintained. So no matter how she moved, we needed to make sure that that shape stayed true to form. So the traditional Maya cloth solver, which we used, would, by its nature, try to, change that shape, and we actually needed to try to make sure that that wasn't the case. Oh, sorry. Okay. Is that better? All right. And then also, other characters also had their unique shapes with the cloth. Like, for example, Shaw, he had this vest, which was kind of a turtle shape, which helped to define his character. Like I said, with the stretching of the characters, as Sean had explained with, as a character would move, the arm would stretch like twice its length at times. That was often, a big concern for us with the cloth, because the cloth would obviously not stretch. So when the character would pull its arm out, we would then have to go afterwards with deformers and extend it to the appropriate length, so that when it played, it made sense, but then the motion still looked fluid. So here's an example of Beth from an early take. So here you can see from our early tests, we were kind of letting the solver do what it normally does. So lots of wrinkles, lots of natural motion to the cloth. And this is a first early take from a shot. Similar approach. The cloth moves more realistically, has a little bit more flow. But this would break a lot of those lines and shapes that we were talking about. So what we would then do is we came up with a targeting system which would allow us to basically, blend out the amount of cloth motion and actually target it to specific shapes from animation or to target shapes that we desired. So later, we were able to keep those shapes consistent, and the style of the cloth was maintained, yet still had a subtle feel of cloth. So cloth for the characters definitely was something more that you felt than you would say, wow, that's definitely dynamic cloth, which was intentional. Oops.
So for Shaw, one of the biggest challenges with him as far as clothing went was that he had this vest. Now, volume cloth is something that is, kind of tricky, obviously, because you have multiple layers of a garment that has to maintain its volume while the character moves around. And like I was just saying, with the graphic nature of our movie, this specific shape, as you can see here, across his back and into his rear here, was very important to keep, maintained, because this was his defining characteristic. So as we set up this character, we actually had an internal vest, which was one plane of cloth that we used to simulate the main motion. So as you can see here, moves around. And then same thing here, now with the volume. So we chose to use the driving inner lining panels so that we could maintain the flow, but also then keep the distance between his arm, let's say, and his inner shirt the same with the vest in between. We also chose to only simulate certain things on the characters that were necessary for the look. So for Shaw, for instance, his vest and his sleeves and his pants are simmed, but the inner lining shirt and thermal are not. And once again, this is the kind of before we've gone ahead and taken out some of the extra motion of the cloth. And then down here is an example of after some, targeting, we've kind of formed it back to more of the stylistic look of his character. Also at times during the film, we were set up with challenges where the cloth would be pushed to such an extreme. In this case, this was Shaw falling down through a waterfall, and his vest had to balloon out like a parachute. And obviously, the rig does not support this. The cloth basically exploded when we tried to do this just out of the box. So we had to make sure that through a lot of post-work, blending of multiple caches and some targeting, we were able to get it to start to kind of work. And this was also a good example of a shot that had to work back and forth with animation, where we would sim it, it would kind of hit its limitations. We'd send it back to animation. They would repose Shaw's arms to an appropriate point that allowed us to get a little bit more of a natural look. So as you can see here, this was kind of before that pass with animation. And then later down here, we have an example of after it's been back through and then once again simmed. And then we added post-wind through other frequencies as well. So we get the nice windy look plus the kind of ballooning effect to his cloth. Not only did we have the character cloth in the film, we also had what we're calling cloth props. So characters would interact with certain things that were dynamic as well, like toilet paper. We also had this scene where Boog and Elliot are kind of brought back into the wild, and through an airlift they are dropped into the wilderness. So this was it also had its challenges with multiple layers of cloth, so an inner blanket mixed with a net, and having to work with the underlying animation of Boog himself. And here's some examples of also just some blankets and things like that where characters are interacting with other more rigid objects, which obviously also has its challenges. Here's another example of multiple character interaction where Boog and Elliot are tumbling through the curtain here on the amphitheater. And early test here, just showing a lot of interpenetration, and also the timing was wrong. So we would refine that and get the cloth to feel like it was settling at the correct motion. Because, not only was it about the simulation, but it was also about the end shape. So the way this would rest was very important. In particular, this shot was also then later used, or this curtain was then later used as a prop in subsequent shots. And we did that a lot where if a prop was needing to be simulated, it then became a static prop for other shots. For the hair of the film, one of the big challenges we had here was obviously the graphic style. I mean, like we've talked about, the shapes are so important to these characters. from the curls on Beth's hair to Shaw's mullet or Boog's, various chevron kind of markings in his neck, back, and arms to like the skunk's plume. I mean, they're very defining features for these characters, and it was very important that we maintain that. From a distance, you saw the main shape, but then you could see also from a close-up the details, which is in essence what the Ivan Earl look is, like we've said. So it was really trying to find that balance between when an object was close up, you saw those details, and then, with the breakup of the fur, but then the overall shape was still maintained. So this was some early sketches that were developed for Boog's look, and I wanted you to kind of pay attention here to a lot of these very specific shapes that were designed for his neck here, which we were calling the chevrons. These kind of multiple layers. Really, I mean, it's his fat of his neck which are curling to create, this kind of broken up look across his neck. And also he had very specific breakup along his back and kind of almost a feathered, kind of feathering negative shapes that came across the underarm here too. So all this was extremely important to try to capture within the fur. This is some early design work, also going from drawing to the paintings to the models that were used. And from early on, when once these were approved, they went into the modeling stage. And one thing that we made sure we got in front of the directors was these fur volumes that I know Sean touched on. These were crucial for us to be able to make sure that the directors were approving stuff that included the hair as a representation. Otherwise, with these long furred creatures, I mean, it's a dramatic difference. I mean, if you were to look at, Boog without his fur, he looks like, almost a third less the size. So, it was really important in 3D quickly with the modeling to get that in there. And then it wasn't as much of a surprise when we put on the fur, it relatively was the same shape. And that was very important. So like I was saying, here are some of we also did a lot of paintings on top of the model. So once the model was approved with its fur volume, the art department painted on top of it. So here's a kind of front and profile of that. So you can see, once again, very defined lines that had to be achieved in the paintings here. So here's two examples of how we did achieve that. So just to briefly talk about how our hair system works. So we use a guide curve system, which then at render time we interpolate with an RI curve, through RenderMan to get you all your hairs. So, there's a finite amount of, control curves that represent his fur. Now, in order to get the kind of breakup and the clumping, we have different algorithms for that, and actually had to come up with a new type of algorithm for these neck pieces, which we called break line clumps, which allowed you to define a region, and then using those control curves, it would actually clump within that region to give you very defined lines, where previously you'd get more like this type of breakup, where it's more just a single curve, which then attracts hairs around it, and that would be a type of clumping. And then this one had to, we didn't really want any more the individual breaking. We wanted a specific line, so we came up with a different algorithm for that, which turned out to work quite nicely. So through a shot here, here's an example of Boog with just the control curves that I mentioned. So, as you can see, it's very few compared to his final render. And then this is an example of one of the hair renders that we did. And then finally, we have the lit render. So in addition to just the curves being driven by the surface, which for a lot of shots just ended up being enough, like Sean had mentioned it earlier in the presentation, they did a lot of work to get the skin to move in a very dynamic way. So having this hair follow that surface, you kind of get that motion for free. But in certain cases, we wanted to plus that and did, in fact, add extra motion to the curves through a dynamic system that we had set up. So here's an example. As you can see, same animation that he had shown earlier, but if you watch the curves themselves, they in turn now have some extra dynamics. In addition to just dynamics alone from a kind of a soft body standpoint, we also had to worry about cases where Boog himself was brushing up upon his own fur. So like his arm swiping his chest turned out to be, a challenge. So we had to then go forward and try to come up with ways to depress and deform curves out of the way to essentially create room for his arms and other objects that would come in contact with him. And then this is the same animation. I'll let it finish here. So here's the same animation now with the hair, and if you watch his arm on the lower right, you can see as it's kind of moving through, it's deforming that hair. And actually, this frame down here is a good example also of some of the different combs that we also had to do. Not only did we have his main comb, but we also had a messy look for when he's after he's gone and trashed the convenience store, which you'll see that sequence later. He's all covered with ketchup, mustard, like kind of like a Slurpee, and all sorts of stuff on him. So it was also something that we had to make sure that the fur represented that. So extra matting and clumped hair was added into his comb to create additional looks for him as well. For Beth, one of the big challenges obviously was her flowing red locks. So her hair was divided into two main sections. We had the front curls and then the back ponytail. The front curls were, they reacted much differently than her back ponytail. The front curls definitely was more of a spring-based motion that we would add to it, and the back ponytail was something that as a whole moved together, but then also in certain circumstances had to splay out and move in different ways. We would also come up with volumes to represent their hair in the early stages of modeling, and then once approved, we then would start the grooming. And just to reiterate, this was an extremely huge time saver, because once you start grooming, when you groom, like I said, you've got these curves, so you're representing the hair with all these finite amount of curves, and that is time consuming. So if you can actually get the roughed in look of the character with just straight geometry, you're almost there as far as not having to rework it, which is obviously a huge expense if you have to go back and start reworking the character. So there's more examples here from the painting with the back ponytail. And pay attention also to some of the very distinctive lines here. This was all, once again, part of that graphic shape where, from a distance, all you're going to really read is, where did the cursor go? Oh, there it is. All you're going to read is the the main kind of hourglass shape of some of these curves, and then internally some of these larger grooves of hair. And her ponytail was made up of 7 different layers of curves in order to represent that depth that every lock had within that ponytail. And then down here we have an example of the turntable of that hair. So once again, you can see how we were able to achieve a lot of that same shape that's actually in the painting. So once again, painting, hair. And then here's some examples of those curves like I spoke about with the dynamics. So if you pay attention to the curls, you can see that they're actually got quite a bit of bounce to them, where the ponytail has some shifting but stays more together as a solid piece. Also to note, the animators had the ability to move and animate these curls as they saw fit, and then we, through the dynamics, were able to target to the animation either 100% in certain circumstances where she might have been using her finger to curl her hair. In other times, we took the animation and then added additional dynamics to give it extra little bounce and life to it as well. So once again, we got curves and then the render. So this is an example of sometimes it doesn't go the way you thought. This was our initial sim, which, as you can see, is quite a different look for Shaw. And then this is obviously how he's supposed to look. One of the other things just to note about Shaw as a character, we had our cloth and hair artists were sometimes cross-trained. So in the cases of this character, we would actually have them do both the cloth simulation and then the hair simulation. This was kind of an added advantage for this character because his cloth obviously drove where the hair would end up being because that mullet had to rest upon that big puffy vest. So that worked out quite well to have the artist first do that cloth sim and then later he would understand, or she, what she was doing with that shot and could then apply the dynamics to the mullet. Yeah, that wasn't pretty. So moving on to the skunk, like I mentioned, the tail is pretty much the main defining characteristic of this character. You can see from the early paintings here that it's very kind of feather-like, almost like a plume of feathers that made up that tail. The other main distinction about this character was that the tail was kind of made up of these three defined sections within the tail. So you had like black, and then a white, and then another black level of hair within that tail. And the way our hair system was set up, obviously it interpolates between the curves. So we actually had to create separate layers that were distinctive between them to create this look. So that was an interesting note on this one. And the fact that it was all hair also played into the dynamics of the character. So down here you can see an example of a lot of the splitting that we have with the breaks. So it was important to try to get that detail. So like I said, the real balance of the look of this film was shape versus finding that ground between where you're getting the design shapes you want, but then you're also, for close-ups, you have that natural breakup so that it still looks like hair and not geometry. So here's an early walk cycle that we had for the skunk with a rigid tail. And then here's an example of the skunks within a shot where now we've added in additional motion on top of what was blocked in through the animation of the tail and the geometry. Here again are two other examples from some other shots. Just pay attention here to how the tails really have kind of that extra life of their own as they interact with the ground, as they spin. The porcupine, which was one of the more stylized, I would say, animals that we had. Essentially like a big soccer ball with these, different layers of quills that we had. So here from our painting, and then here into the actual comb. So, from initial drawings, we got an idea of how, from the inner body, from the surface to the middle layer of quills and to the outer quills, how we were going to set up this character from a hair perspective. Oops. And then also, not only did we, stylistically have to, worry about how these quills were going to lie, they also had to move appropriately. So the different types of motion here, we gave the quills kind of an animation, like an ambient kind of, little bit of a kind of ambient motion to them, and then obviously for specific performance reasons, obviously we also had to then animate them specifically. We also had our psycho ducks in the film, which it was very important to the directors on this one that the ducks were concerned that the shape was mostly what you read. So this silhouette here, in the drawing was what they wanted you to perceive most of all about the duck, and not so much about stray feathers or things like that. So we had to make sure that when we feathered this duck that we kept the comb very tight to the surface. So he's actually a mixture of kind of a feathery hair down along his face, and then it transitions into a feather for down his neck and into his body. This kind of shows you a little bit of the layout for our feathers as we use a similar system as far as like you'd use one feather shape as a guide to interpolate other feathers. It's a little bit more tricky for feathers because you're not just worrying about a single line, you're worrying about something that, based on its orientation, may start to intersect feathers around it, and that can obviously be tricky. So little other challenges when it comes to feathers. So here you can see these are some early kind of motion tests with the duck and how the feathers are working. And based off of this, we got direction to even further kind of refine, just making sure that the feathers were more concealed within the overall shape of the duck. So down here you can see from a final shot how the feathers really became more of a detail within the character and not so much something that would break the contour. In addition to the main combs characters, we also had additional wet looks that we had to work on for the various scenes where they would get, obviously, through rain, dropping into the whitewater rapids, and of that nature. So also very stylized in the sense that you have these very straight lines and then a lot of kind of that clumped hair down at the bases of things. Once again, the tail here is a very good example of that. Very clean line at the top, but then obviously much more clumped detail as it hangs and you feel that weight. So from Boog, we also wanted to make sure that we maintained a lot of those kind of lines around the neck like we had spoke about, but then within his fur you got a lot more of that clumped, wet, kind of almost spiked look to the fur, and then obviously we added additional shaders to enhance the specular look of that. Here's a good example with a side-by-side where we had our dry rabbit and then the wet look. So you can see how the tail was, volume-wise, kind of like a fluffy pom-pom look, and then gets, shrunk down and dropped, and you get that droop, which, once again, we've got the clean line and then the kind of details underneath that. And then here's just a close-up of that as well. Another good example, back to the the fur volumes. So this is what would be kind of an approved look of a fur volume from a modeling stage. This was then in turn used as a guide to create the comb for the character. So based on these shapes, we would know that you had to hit these certain marks with the curves so that you would know dimensionally. Better than just a draw over or a single frame, the artist could spin this model around and get the appropriate curves in the right place, and it would be done in a fraction of the time. For this specific character, we also rigged those curves into these volumes. So if you see this is just a facial posing test. You see how those shapes are moving. So now, having just those curves rigged in, you get all that motion for free. So in this particular case, we didn't add anything on top of just placing the curves in, no additional dynamics, yet we were able to get a lot of expression, and that fur was able to just travel nicely with these volumes, and that also was a benefit for the animators because then they could see what those volumes were doing while they were animating, and they would know what to expect. We also had cases where we had windy hair, and this kind of also broke some of the rules. Like I'd mentioned, like Beth's ponytail tried to stay as one piece, but in cases like this, we needed the rig to be able to handle the splitting and splaying of a lot of those locks of hair. So the dynamic rigs were important to be flexible in that nature. And here's also an example of Shaw's mullet on the windy high seas of the Whitewater Rapids. And then, these two up here are good examples of kind of the macro dynamics, but then, we also had to deal with some of the very internal, smaller details of wind. So here, even down to the smallest stuff on Boog's nose, you can see has some really great movement and detail. Well, on to effects. So with the effects of the film, an important note is that the effects were, I'll just back up, except for the dam breaking sequence with the water, effects in the film were kind of more of something that enhanced the scene. They were never really the main stars. So in order to kind of just make sure that they had the style nature of the Ivan Earl look, we kind of just backed off on the realistic nature of the effects. Some of the challenges we had in the effects department were coming up with ways to attach objects to the fur. In a lot of cases, Boog got in situations where things were matted or embedded in his fur, and then he would have to move around and things would fall off him. So we came up with a way to actually figure out the actual points on those curves that were rendered and then place the objects and then through soft body and rigid body dynamics get the look. So this was early test for the pine cone sequence, and this was the same shot that Sean had showed you where Boog falls out of the back of Beth's truck, and you can see all the stuff that kind of falls off of him. In addition to the characters having stuff embedded in them, we also had characters moving through environments like tall grasses, which once again had to make sure that they adhered to the volume of the characters as they moved through. We also had some fire in the film. And the fire was also, like I said, it's this idea that we're just fire had to kind of move realistically, but the details were where we kind of allowed it to be stylized. So paid attention mostly to the overall contour of the outside of the shape of the fire, but internally we reduced some of the details and some of the movement that we would normally do for photorealistic fire. This fire was using an internal, a volume shader in RenderMan, which gave us some interesting shading for the depth within the fire. We also had dust and smoke, which we have our own sprite render for that. So pretty common stuff for smoke and dust. For the skunks, the directors wanted something very specific. They wanted something that would define the skunk spray that you saw in that earlier clip as its own thing. So we had what we call our strand render of particles, which are just instanced RI points that are based off of a spline. So this kind of gives you a much different look where things have kind of that more cigarette smoke feel. So that was a nice added bonus to have something in the film that just by itself was distinctive. We also had our explosions, which were based off of a Maya fluid, and then later were piped into Houdini, and we applied the same volume shader to that to get more internal details that we couldn't achieve through the Maya system. So the water. So the dam break sequence, like Doug had mentioned, was definitely a key part of the effects challenge. Once again, the style of the film was very important, that the water itself had that look, the Ivanhoe look. So detail, when water was close up, there was a lot of details in the foam, the spray, the surface detail itself, and then further away we reduced it down to more of its simple shapes. Stylistically, we kind of, as far as from photoreal, we kind of pulled back on some of the details that we might have put into some of the foam and made it a little bit more stylized, and also with the shading and how we dealt with reflections and refractions, we're a little bit more stylized. The main thing that we couldn't really back off on was how water moved, because from early tests we noticed that if we kind of played around too much with that, it started to not really feel like water anymore. So it was very important that the water system still flowed like water. So we wrote our own fluid-based tool, which here's a version of an early pour test as it flows down. Experimented with different viscosities. As you saw, we had a little vomit test, so we needed to make sure that the fluid could look like different types of liquid. And this is an early test of the dam breaking, just proving that we can get the particles to flow around some of the objects and still interact appropriately. In addition to obviously the fluid, we also needed explosions of water, so lots of mist, huge events like that. So these were done with multiple clustered RI points at render time to get that nice full look. And then here's an example of the two put together. So you have the 3D flow intermixed with a leading edge foam and reaction foam to the log falling into the water. Here's an example of a breakdown of one of our 3D flood systems. So from early rough layout, we would send them kind of our first initial sim, which is just based on the surface itself. Roughed in character animation, obviously. Not even character animation, just rough layout animation. And then from there, the animators took the timing that we had given them from this sim and worked out the characters' movements. So as you can see, Boog and Elliot riding on top of there. And then we would get that back from them and then create the final elements using the full system with the foam and fluid. And then here's the final shot. And it was also interesting because certain shots required certain events to happen differently. So in some cases where it was a case like this, where the timing of the wave is what's most important to start the timing of the characters, we actually had to give them meaning animation, the water sim first. In other shots where it was, let's say, a close-up on Boog and Elliot on the log, then animation could start before effects was even done. So we actually scrubbed the whole sequence before we started to kind of figure out which shots would be effects that would then lead into animation, and then other shots that would be effects-driven, or animation-driven, and then later effects added to it. Here's early examples of our river surface. So different to the flood. So the flood was a 3D sim, and then the river was a two-dimensional sim on the surface. So here's an example of the flow that we added to the river surface. And then on top of the flow, we added kind of a wave chop noise, which would then, give you that more kind of at high seas feel. And then also on top of that, we would add a 2D foam layer that would be driven off of the velocities of the particles in the simulation, so that you would get more dense areas of foam where the particles were more active. And then on top of that, we added 3D foam as well for where the water would peak. So where you would get crests of the waves, it would then kick off three-dimensional foam that would then kick up into the air. And then as that foam would land onto the surface, it would in turn generate the two-dimensional foam. So you had all these different events happening. Also, as foam here, as you can see, interacts with the rocks, you also got foam that would then get created. So, we had many different kind of triggers that would just cause these different effects based on what was happening. And then here's another example. As you can see, the waves are actually cresting against the flow as well. So what was nice about the system is that it took into consideration the environment that it was in. So depending upon how the topology of that river basin was modeled, you would get different reactions to the simulation, and that would give you a lot of different details. So here's an example of the same layout using the 2D river example. So this was a good example here where the previous example was effects leading. This was an example of animation leading. So we started from final layout in this one because animation didn't actually interfere with the water, so we could run separately. So we got final layout, created the initial surface, which here you can see we're using a lot of that chop to get that kind of that high seas feel. And then that chop, in turn, gave you all this foam on the surface. And then, that's the rendered surface. And then in addition to the foam surface, we also added what we call cliff crash, which is additional foam elements that were, reacting to the sides of the rocks and stuff like that. And then here's the final cone. So one of the last elements, too, of the water, and this kind of gets into the macro to micro approach of the water system, we had our main surfaces. So you have the water river itself. But then you would also have specific instances where characters would be dropped into the water. And we needed the ability to be able to say, okay, now that area around that character needs to be a lot more, high res, and we need to be able to get the details of a splash and different reactions, waves and whatnot of that character moving through that. So we had the ability to map on a higher res mesh projected onto the surface of the main surface of the river, and it would follow the contours of the existing wave patterns that were on that surface, and then we would add in, based on this high res patch, all the secondary splashes of whatever character object was being dropped into that patch, and then we would seam it all up so that the end result was one fluid surface. This gave us a lot of advantages so that when directors asked us to change one element on, let's say, the splash interaction, we didn't have to go back and resim the whole thing, which was a huge, huge time saving. So here's an example of one of those patches as the character moves through. You can see how they're interacting, creating the waves, the initial splashes, the peak, all the secondary splashes that happen when the water that leaves then hits back onto the surface, causing secondary ripples. Here's that same simulation now with the shading, also showing you the foam that's getting generated as those splashes hit the water. Another view of it, same idea. So not only did we have to worry about one character interacting on this splash, we also wanted to be prepared for when multiple things would enter into the water. So same system, but now we're introducing multiple objects and things running and smashing through itself. So, it was kind of we were happy to see this test work. And then lastly, here's some examples of shots where like I said, we have the main river in this case, and then, perfect example, we have multiple characters falling into the water. So once again, you have your main system, which is your river, and then these individual high-res patches that represent the splashes projected onto the specific areas of the river, and then all sealed back together, creating one fluid surface. Similarly, here's beavers jumping off the dam. They're very elegant. And then here's some bunnies dropping back in the water. And that pretty much sums it up for me. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Darren. So I just wanted to add one thing to what Darren said. Directors at one point asked us they wanted to put a fur backpack, this teddy bear backpack on Boog. Boog has this backpack that reminds him of home, and once he gets kicked into the wild, Beth gives it to him so he remembers home. So they want basically this fur-covered teddy bear. No. Oh, sorry. Right there. It's after that. Next one. So they want this fur-covered teddy bear to be on Boog's back, So we say, no, you can't have that because, like Darren just told you, the characters are covered in fur. And as Sean said, they just have a representation of where that fur is going to land. So to lay a backpack on the back of that, have it covered in fur, expect him to be able to go through his poses and work, it wasn't going to happen. So we said no. So we got right to work on that. And basically, I have to tell you how amazing it was. Because what it really required was hand-holding. Every shot that had the teddy bear backpack on Boog basically had to come out of animation where they posed the backpack straps on his chest, and when he would twist, those straps would interpenetrate into the shoulders, fur would pop through, fur would go into his body, all that. So once it came out of hair had to then try and readjust the backpack, do renders, see if they could see where it existed, move the strap kind of frame by frame. We had probably, 50 shots in the movie where we had this exact scenario. And that's what had to happen. They had to hold it all the way. And I'm amazed that we did it to this day and highly recommend you don't do it. So had to tell you about that. So here's a sequence for you to kind of culminate everything Darren just showed you. It's our breaking the dam sequence, and you're the second crowd ever to have seen it, so please enjoy.